Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Employee Pension and Trust Committee for the City of Franklin. It's March 27th. The first item on the agenda would be to call our meeting to order. I will do a roll call vote. Mr. Townsend, are you present?
Yes.
Ms. Carter?
Yes.
Mr. Bull?
Here.
Mr. McGee?
Yes.
And let the record show that Mr. McDaniel and the mayor are not present for the meeting. Chair is also present, so that'll take care of the roll call vote. Let's do item number one, actually, I guess it is, consideration of the minutes for the December meeting. Hope everyone's had a chance to take a look at those. Any corrections, deletions to those? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion to approve.
Proper motion to a second.
Second.
Then let's do a roll call vote on those. Mr. Townsend, how do you vote?
Yes.
Ms. Carter, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Bull, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. McGee, how do you vote?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes on those. So the next item on the agenda would be the investment report for the quarterly funding. Let's go ahead and go to item 3 then. Never mind. I see Mr. Bryant coming in. And
I apologize, I started gabbing with Russ and lost track of time.
that's, well, we'll forgive you this time then, if it's Russ. Go ahead. We've already gone through, opening of minutes. We're ready for item 2, if you want to do the quarterly report.
I can do a little introduction while Barry is
Okay,
getting
great.
himself set up, and
Let me ask one question though.
let's make sure you get it. We need you a microphone.
I've got, that one. I'm just wondering what you all can you all see these screens well enough? Oh, you've got reports though in front of you, right? Okay.
Yes, the committee has the hard copy that you provided, and they've
Yep.
also received the electronic version ahead of time as well.
Okay.
So while Barry is getting situated, we're very glad to have him with us for our spring meeting. And this is and one of the reasons we asked to have him here with us is because our closed pension, the actuarial valuation is based it's based off of the asset valuation for December 31st. It's based on the calendar year. We do have what we call our open pension plan is based off June 30th, which is a state fiscal year, but this closed plan is December 31st. And this is also timely because the city administrator is getting ready in May to give his budget presentation for fiscal year 24. And the next 3 items that we're going to talk about are items that are large percentages, or they're significant percentages of what he will be including to fund in his fiscal 24 budget, is the acquired pension contributions that will be required for both of the plans. So having Barry here with us to be able to give a presentation about the asset valuation for the fourth quarter of 2022, as well as to have some dialogue with the committee and Barry about the economy, the assets valuation, and what that looks like. Perhaps, I don't know how much. Certainly, we don't know exactly how 2023 will unfold, but it's very important. How our assets perform and what that means for future contributions to our closed pension plan. So I believe Barry is now set up, and if you'd like to start off with your comments, Barry, but then certainly if Alderman Barnhill, our chairman, will facilitate some Q&A, that would
Yes.
probably be this would be a good time to do that.
I'm going to try to restrain myself a little bit because this is the kind of time when somebody that does what I do just wants to talk a lot, because there's a lot to say. There's a lot to say about us. There's a lot to say about the world at large, but I'm going to skip over some of those points, and I'll leave that to Q&A if you want to know more about it. So the bottom line for us is we did poorly relative to average in the fourth quarter, but the fourth quarter was a good quarter. We made money. We did better than average in the first 3 quarters. The first 3 quarters on an absolute basis were an unmitigated disaster. for the world at large, not just for us. Combining all that, our plan did quite well because 3 down quarters, 1 up quarter, and we did better in the 3 down quarters, bottom line. And that's what I'm going to purport to explain. So starting on page 4, you can look at our little charts here that try to conceptualize the economy in about 16 pretty easy numbers. So what's going on with the economy generally, the economy is growing at an average or slightly above average rate right now, despite all the hubbub, and the unemployment rate is at a 40-year low, and it's just sitting there. It just won't move despite the Fed's best efforts. So everything would be great were it not for inflation. Inflation, unfortunately, is running 6% plus, given whatever number has come out that particular week, and the Fed is fighting mightily to try to get that down. My belief is that the Fed is going to do whatever is necessary to get this inflation number down at least below 3 and maybe all the way down to 2, and that is going to take some real doing. There are a lot of people that don't think they're going to be willing to do that, and a lot of those people came out of the woodwork after the Silicon Valley Bank default because they said, you're going to destabilize the whole financial system. And then the Fed chairman got up 3 days later and said, yep, we're raising it another quarter point. Too bad about the financial system. We're going to do our best to keep the banks solvent or get them acquired, but we don't care. And I think that's what he really believes in his heart of hearts. This is the time that really tests a Fed chairman. How much pain are you willing to put the economy through in order to control inflation? But I think he's willing to do it, even if it requires pushing the economy into recession. And for the record, I expect the economy to go into a mild recession at some point this year, and I've been saying that for about 6 months now, because I just think that's what's going to be necessary to get the closer, as with anything, the closer you get to your target, the harder it is to get things done, to get those last few tenths of a point of inflation out. So that's what I think about the Fed. Now, the market. The market is the discounted present value of future cash flows of all the companies that are traded publicly. Now, what does that mean? That means that just like the actuary takes liabilities in the future, divides by a discount rate, and brings that to the past, people that invest in the stock market take the earnings of a company, use a discount rate, discount it to the past to get the value of that company. That is the theory of stock market prices. Now, what that implies is that every time that discount rate changes a little bit, and I think you may hear some stuff about your own plan, in relationship to that, but as that number changes a little bit, the whole value of the stock market changes. Now, is that any different than it is any other time? Well, no, except in the sense that when you have inflation at 2%, 1.8%, 2.1%, think about that variance. It's like this. When you have inflation at 8%, 6%, the numbers are going around like wild. And the numbers that affect the stock market valuation aren't real numbers. They're real numbers, and then the market going, what's the Fed going to do in response to this real number? And they're guessing what the number is going to be going forward. And that's why you're seeing all this wild volatility. And it's not going to stop until that number gets back down to the Fed's 2% target. That range becomes tight, and then things will return to normal, whatever the normal is. But that's what's going on in the stock market now. That's that variation that you're seeing in it. So now to set the scene for the return. So in the fourth quarter, and I'm now going to go, one other thing worth mentioning, U.S. dollars per euro. This is a very big deal, actually, from an investment standpoint. The dollar is weakening, or was weakening, and we expect it to continue, and that may make foreign stocks better investments than domestic stocks, which has not, generally speaking, been true for over a decade. The value of the dollar, very important. Now, in terms of what the market did, you can see it all in this report, in the quarter, in the year. You can see a bear market, you can see a bull market, and you can see how this portfolio characteristically performs. So let's do the bull market first, and then we'll have the bear market to tamp down our happiness. So Russell 3000 was up 7%, and I'm going to round these numbers. Foreign stocks were up about 14%. That's combining EFA, which are developed foreign stocks, and the emerging market stocks. The U.S. aggregate, that's a measure of all domestic bonds of investment grade, was up almost 2%, and real estate was down 5%. That's because of the dislocation in the office market, which in question and answer I can talk about if you want, but that was the one piece that was down. So up 7% in a quarter, that's about as much as you expect the stock market to go up in a year. So I mean, this is a raging bull market in the fourth quarter. The median portfolio had a return of 5.9% in this quarter, and we'll look at our returns in just a minute. Now, let's flip over to the 12 months. The 12 months includes, believe it or not, the fourth quarter. And even though it includes the fourth quarter, domestic stocks were down 19. Foreign stocks were down 15. Bonds were down 13. And then real estate was the only thing that had a positive return, was up 7.5%. This is the worst year for a classic 60-40 portfolio, and it probably for 65-35, 60% bonds, 40% stocks. I'm sorry, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, for a mixed portfolio ever. Because the stock market and the bond market don't normally go up and down at the same time. And in fact, the bond market almost never goes down. And if it goes down by a little bit. 13%. I think this is the worst year, maybe the worst year for bonds ever. So this was really a bad year. It was a year when you wanted to be good on defense, and we were pretty good on defense, as it turns out, and that's why our numbers are good for the year. So let's turn now to page 8, and we'll go over our numbers, and then I'll break them down a little bit. So for the quarter, we returned 4.3%. The percentile was the 91st percentile. 1 is the best, 100 is the worst. So we underperformed 91%. I'm sorry, I'm not doing the math right there, am I? We underperformed 90% of the portfolios out there. We only beat 7 or 8. So this is really not a very good number. I said 5.9%. Oh, no, that's not right. That number's not on this page. 5.9% was the median return. Now, if we go over to the 1-year number, we did negative 10.8%. The median return for the 1 year was negative, and that's not on this page, was negative 13.2%. So for the full year, including the underperformance in the fourth quarter, we beat the averages by over 2 percentage points, and that's a lot. That's a huge win. Now, why did we do that well? Let's go, well, I want to point one other thing because it's really easiest to see on this page, and then we'll get into the TCRS portfolio. All the timber and the one piece of private equity that we have, which TCRS is now overseeing, but which we entered away from TCRS, they helped this quarter, especially the timber. The timber is intended to be a bond substitute, but it responds positively to inflation. It has not done that well because the housing market has been depressed since 2008. The housing market is coming back, although if they raise interest rates enough and keep their high enough, it'll kill that, but it'll come back again. So the timber funds are having some decent appreciation right now, and that really helped bump us up a little bit. That helped some. So let's now go to TCRS, which I think we've got broken down on 16. No, not 16, 18. Yes, page 18. So the return for the TCRS portfolio was negative 11.3. And one of the things that I've harped on a lot because it's unusual is this long duration bond portfolio. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. The longer the duration, the more it goes down. And indeed, their bond portfolio got killed. It was down 20% when the aggregate, which is the core that most people are in, was down only 13%. And yet, despite that fact, the portfolio did really well. It did well because real estate was the only of the major asset classes that had positive returns, and they did double the real estate average, 18.7 versus 7.5. I'm reading about 2/3 of the way down the second column. Their strategic lending portfolio didn't do incredibly well on an absolute basis, but did a whole lot better than everybody else did. It beat the benchmark by about 5 percentage points, a little bit more than that. And so those two factors made a big difference. And then in the equity pieces, 2 of the 3 equity pieces, North American equity and international emerging market equity, did significantly better than their benchmarks. European equity did not do quite as well, but the other 2 did. So I think the way to think about this is their asset allocation wasn't necessarily so great, but they executed what they were in extremely well, did better than other people did. And because of that, they were able to lose a lot less money this year than most people did. And so I would call this another win for this strategy, although they got it in a little different way than they have before. If interest rates start going down, now let's think for a minute, and I've now changed subjects again, we're now going forward. So let's look at the first quarter. January's like the fourth quarter. February's kind of like the fourth quarter, and then March it all goes back down again. And I think everything is going to be, probably close to zeros by the time the dust clears. I haven't seen the numbers as of the close of the end of the week, but the market was just going down, and all the gains we had in the first 2 months were going away. I think the market's likely to continue to go down. I think we are going to go into recession, but once we get into that recession, the market will then look through that to the recovery, and you'll start to see the market go, why is the market going up? We're in the middle of a recession. There's a classic question. Well, it's because the market's forward-thinking, not present-thinking. So I expect the market to end the year higher at the end than it is right now, but it's not going to be a straight path to get there. And so that is, oh, and the last thing about the interest rates. If the Fed pushes the economy into recession, especially if it pushes it too far, they're going to backtrack very, very quickly. And you're going to see them lowering interest rates, adding liquidity, trying to reverse the damage that they've done to get inflation under control. And if they do that, that long duration bond portfolio, interest rates down, bond portfolio is up, the longer the duration, the more it goes up, it will outperform in that kind of environment, which I expect to take place, but not in the next couple of quarters. So that's the market, the economy, where you all are for the quarter and for the year. Another good quarter, nothing to be unhappy about here as far as the way they're managing your money. And that's it. I'm happy to answer questions. I'll talk about Silicon Valley Bank if you want me to talk about Silicon Valley Bank, the banking system generally.
Any questions from the committee? Eric, any questions?
I numbed you into submission.
I do have a question.
Aye.
And this is more of something perhaps, Barry, you could give a little bit of elaboration, but when you were describing we call them the non-conforming assets that TCRS is assisting us to manage, but they were, back when the TCRS began managing our funds, it was just not financially a good decision to liquidate those. We left them and let them run their course. I believe there's 2 of those that will be running their course in 23 and 24, I believe.
One of them is that they're there in order. Landmark is one. That's the private equity fund. There's almost no money in Landmark, right? There's actually almost no money in either of them. But Landmark's going to run off, and the BTG Pactual Timberland.
I think we call it RMS Timber. Is that
I'm
it?
sorry. Yes.
The RMS Timber, and I just wanted to point this out to our committee because they've been seeing these lists for many years, and I'm going to go back and just find one of them. But we do have 2 of these that I don't know the exact timing that they're going to run their course, but from what I can tell, it's going to be, if we consider the next year or 2, the near term, they are going to be running their course. So let's see here. I'll find one of these charts in here that has that, Barry.
Oh, yeah, those are at the end. BTG is...
There's one of the lists, and this is a list of fees, but they still have the list of these non-conforming assets on page 8 of Barry's report. And you'll see of course, we've got most of our funds are in the TCRS, but then there's several or a handful of other assets that Barry keeps up with, as well as TCRS and Landmark, and then the RMS Forest Fund, RMS Timber. I believe those two are going to be running their course in the near term, Barry. Is that your understanding?
Well, let me go to okay, go to page 11. BTG is the one that's almost extinguished. Now, they've changed their name. I think they've changed their name twice since we own them, but that's the one that's almost extinguished. RMS, I believe, is the one that lasts the longest. But I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, it's one of those two.
But we had talked back, I think even this committee had talked back in 16 when the process was going through to liquidate assets that could be liquidated, and these remained. There's a couple of these that are on their way out, and certainly as those we receive proceeds from these assets, we just reinvest that back into the TCRS
Right.
pool. So that's part of the asset allocation that TCRS
Yeah.
is
And
managing.
when they call them non-conforming, I've never heard that phrase used in this context before. It almost suggests that there's something wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with them. It's not.
It's non-conforming
what
to TCRS's asset policy.
Yes, okay, it's important to make that distinction because yes, and that is a problem because they're watching something for us that's not part of their usual deal, which was a nice service that they're providing. But they are called, in our business, the accountants call them alternative assets because the accounting is different. We just put them in a different asset class because we don't care about the accounting rules so much. But it has to do with the fact that the assets don't trade on public markets. Their value has to be estimated until the life of the fund is over and everything is sold and you can take all the money and count it up. So there are a lot of different phrases that are applied to them.
And I do agree with Barry. While they're defined as non-conforming for TCRS purposes, they certainly are. They're assets, and these are types of assets that pensions hold. They just did not fit the program that TCRS manages. They do watch it. We all receive notifications from those assets, but we do have a couple of those that are on their way. And they just kind of will simplify these reports. So if you don't see one or two of these over the next year or so, certainly I'm going to do my best to do a statement that one of them is completely extinguished. But that's what's going on.
Any other questions or comments? Did you mention the Silicon Bank?
I said I'm happy to talk about it if you want me to talk about it.
Yeah, let's listen.
Okay, let me start with the beginning.
Okay.
Do you understand, and of course the second question is, do you want to understand, what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, just in very simple terms? Why Silicon Valley Bank is no more? Yes, no? It's not a quiz. This isn't like school. There was no homework you haven't done.
so
I just don't want to
don't
spend a
roll up
lot
our
of time.
hands, right?
Because, I mean,
Yeah.
we can talk and some of you are in the financial services business and this is what you do every day. It is not what I do every day. I had to read a little bit and talk with some people to figure it out. All right, so think about a bank, and a bank's got, two sides of its ledger. It's got assets and it's got liabilities. Now, the liabilities will keep it a little simpler than it really is for explanatory purposes. A liability is something that somebody gives them that they owe back to them. A deposit's a liability. You give them money, they have to pay you the money back. So they've got all these deposits on this side of the ledger. On the other side of the ledger, they have assets. So they can take that money and they can do a variety of things with it. The thing a bank normally does is it lends money to customers. So it takes your deposit, it lends it to a customer, it pays you 1%, it charges the customer 3%, it makes a 2% spread, and that's its profit. And that's the way a bank works. And there are a lot of complicators and multipliers in this or that, but that's the basic deal. So What happened in this case is that Silicon Valley Bank did something on both sides of the balance sheet that became problematic, would be a nice way of saying it. For your deposits, what they did was they took all the money from all the venture capital businesses in Silicon Valley that was being funded by a variety of people, but particularly a guy named Peter Thiel, who comes into this story a little bit later on. So Peter Thiel would identify a private company. He would raise money for the private company and give it to them to develop, but until they needed it, they would deposit it in Silicon Valley Bank. And Silicon Valley Bank had hundreds of these private equity companies in Silicon Valley that had been funded, and they just put their money into there. It was the go-to bank for funding Silicon Valley. The problem with that is all of these businesses kind of did the same thing. Now, if you're running a real estate portfolio, one of the things that you use to stress test your real estate portfolio is you want to know exposure that you have to regions of the country, to different types of real estate risk, but also to different types of businesses. You want to worry about if you put all your money into the tech business, what happens if the tech business goes into recession and you don't have a few little drops of your portfolio, you've got 50% of your, so you want to diversify. Silicon Valley Bank did not diversify. They just took all this money because it was flowing through the doors like nobody's business. And the secondary problem with that was that money wasn't insured. $250,000 is the FDIC insurance cap. So if you raised, $30 million in an equity offering, the first $250,000 was insured. The second $29,750,000 was not insured, and you, in theory, could lose that money. And that's important from a psychological perspective. So that was what was happening on that side of the balance sheet. And at one point, Peter Thiel picks up the phone, pulls his money out, calls his clients, tell them to pull their money out, and the next day, all the money's leaving. That literally happened. Now, the question is, why did he make that phone call? And the Justice Department is investigating that even as we speak. I can't believe he was too... these are very sophisticated people. I'm sure he discussed this with his attorneys, but he could have been in possession of inside information. He could have gotten a tip from the inside. He could have just looked at the bank's balance sheet himself and figured it out. This is not complicated stuff. It sounds like, gee, this sounds awfully simple if you're a banker. Well, it is. This is pretty simple if you're a banker, that something like this could happen. And we'll get back to that at the end. So now we go over to the other side of the balance sheet. So what do they invest their money in? They invested their money in treasuries. Treasuries are safe. They're not going to go bankrupt. There's no credit risk, but there is interest rate risk. And what that means, and I've said this enough times, I hope it's sunk in, interest rates up, bond prices down. So what happened? The Fed starts raising interest rates. The value of these treasuries that they had invested, these were their assets. The value of those treasuries is going down. Now, to make matters worse, they didn't have to report it because those declines were not realized. They were on the balance sheet. They weren't worth what they were on the balance sheet for, but they didn't have to report that until the money started fleeing the bank. And then they had to raise money to shovel out the door. And when that happened, they had to start selling those. And when they sold them, they had to mark to market, and they wiped their equity capital out virtually overnight. So, in a nutshell, they had deposits that were systemically tied to one industry that because of the logic of that industry fled. That was a mistake on their part. And they lost money on what they had it invested in because interest rates up and the value of their bonds went down. And that was a mistake. That's called asset liability matching in the banking business, a fundamental thing bankers do. And so they were out of business overnight. Now, here comes the next question. The Fed supervises that bank. What was the Fed doing? Well, they were issuing warnings. I always say when people talk about putting a manager on watch list, we sort of don't believe in watch lists. It's one of my pet peeves. All consulting firms use it. My thing about watch lists is you can only do one of two things. You can either have the manager in there or you can pull it. You can watch him, but if you watch him, you may watch the ball. If it's a pitcher, the ball may end up going over the center field fence. And that was the case here. They kept issuing warnings, but they didn't do anything about it. Eventually, the ball went over the center field fence. That's what happened. So the Fed is looking at its own processes because clearly this is not complicated stuff. Like I said before, this is very basic banking 101 and very basic regulatory banking 101 that wasn't done appropriately. And this really falls on the San Francisco Fed. They were the ones that were in charge of this. We're going to be reading about this for a long time, as we're going to be reading dissections of the inflation scenario. You know, all the things get wrong. The famous Warren Buffett quote, there are many famous Warren Buffett quotes, but one of them, when the water goes out, you see who doesn't have a swimming suit. And that's absolutely true in financial services. It's only at these periods of stress when you understand what people were getting away with that they shouldn't have been doing. And that's what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, in a nutshell. Other questions? Now, how does that affect us? The Fed is on the two sides of the ledger about raising interest rates. They now have a new thing on the other side of the ledger. They may destabilize the banking system, and they've obviously got to think about that. It's also not good for currency exchange and what it does, particularly to emerging market countries, and then it gets into some complexities. But that's the way it affects us. It limits their ability to raise interest rates, although they did it. I mean, they did it the last time. Anyway.
Any questions? That was interesting.
Well, thank you. Did everybody understand that?
I think so.
I taught high school, and you know, you say everybody understand that, and then you get the test bit. Nope.
Nope. If there are no other questions of Barry, let's go to item 3. That is a report of the employee contribution rate for the open pension plan effective July the 1st, 2023.
And this is something that we bring to you as a report. This is when the city of Franklin agreed to go into the state of Tennessee's retirement system back in 2017. We get the opportunity for our city administrator to sign and to send that annual employer rate back in. We agree to pay the employer rate as set by their actuary for the state of Tennessee. So this is a report of what our new employer funding rate will be for the fiscal year 24. And that is a employer rate of 7.35% of salary for all of the employees that are members of the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System plan for the next fiscal year. That is an increase from 7.22% in this current fiscal year. These are based off of an actuarial report dated June 30th of 2022. It's a state fiscal year rather than a plan year. So it's a slight increase, but not nearly as great as you might anticipate, because certainly we looked at significant losses in asset valuations for our own closed plan. I'm sure that was the case as well with the state plan. And we also have, in fact, the state has a lower investment rate than we currently have on our closed plan. You'll notice just here at the very top of the screen, the investment rate for the state of Tennessee is at 6.75%, and I believe we're at 7. We're going to 6.9 on this next report for our own plan, and so their investment rate assumption was slightly less. However, we do have there's an asset valuation method that we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes, which the state has recommended that we move to in our closed plan, that is used by the state of Tennessee, called asset smoothing valuation method, and that is incorporated. We have the right people here that will talk about it from mathematical terms, but I'll give you just my take that's not as mathematical, is that asset smoothing, it certainly, you won't have the highs and you won't have the lows, because in the state of Tennessee's case, they actually do this smoothing over a 10-year period. And so when the assets go up very highly, you're not going to see a big drop in your contribution. But when the assets go down, you're not going to see this big swing that you might expect going up. So it's going to stabilize, but it's still going to be, it's still an accurate method of making sure that your pension is funded over the long haul. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but we do have this 7.35%. We've started plugging that into city administrator's budget proposal, and we've already, he's already submitted the acceptance of this rate for next year. And this is and also for staff, this is our first chance to look at, this is a mini version of the actuarial study for the open pension plan. We won't get our full report until later this summer, but it is interesting that this plan's been in existence since 2017 with new hires, so it grows fairly slowly, even though we've hired a lot of people since then. But we're now at $4.6 million of actuarial value of assets. It's grown quite a bit from zero back in 2017. So that's what happens with a pension plan. So that is what we'll be funding as the employer for the next year. Our employees fund 5% employee contribution. That is fixed. It's the employer contribution rate that will change based off of this actuarial studies that are done every year. And if there are any questions, we'll be glad to, but we do want you to be aware that has been received.
Any questions? Seeing none, then let's go to item 4, report of the actuary.
This is preliminary funding status results and recommended contribution for the claims plan. I think we typically present preliminary results early in the year and then final results at the end. So, and contribution rate increase here will look very different than what Christine just talked about for the open plan. So first column you'll see here is just historical information where we were a year ago, using a discount rate of 7%. The total contribution recommended was just over 4.1 million, and that represents about 14% of payroll. And that contribution breaks down between what we call the net normal cost, which is the value of new benefits earned by the current population, and an amortization of unfunded liability. And last year those numbers were pretty equal, between 1.9 and $2 million each. Then we're kind of stair-stepping over each column, add some changes for the current year. So first we're looking at the impact of demographic assumption change, or demographic data changes, really anything, I'm sorry.
Make sure the green light.
Thank you. So this column shows the impact of demographic updates, really everything except for our discount rate change, our asset valuation method change, and the asset loss for 2022. So the impact of these demographic updates is about an increase in the contribution of $857,000. And this really breaks down into 3 key components. One is the COLA, which was higher than expected. So that represents about 1/3 of that increase in the contribution. And it's something we, of course, knew would happen with a higher COLA. Second were salary increases higher than our assumption, which also translates into a contribution increase, or about 1/3 of that total increase. And then the last was really all other things, retirements, terminations, different than expected, which also had a relatively small impact, but about 1/3 of that $857,000 increase in the contribution you see. Then moving into the next column, this is the big one. This is the impact of asset losses for 2022. And as Barry mentioned, in absolute terms, it was a 10.9% loss. And of course, the way we look at it is a loss versus expected, which takes it up to a 17.9, because we expected a 7% gain, but it was a 10.9% loss. So the net difference there is 17.9%. And so that was about a $27.8 million loss versus expected. And so that gets amortized into the contribution over a 20-year period. And so that alone increases the contribution by just under $2.6 million per year. So that's the biggie there. And that takes the contribution as a percent of payroll up to just over 25%. And of course, we're also on our stair step down in the discount rate, moving from 7 to 6.9. That has a relatively small impact increase in the contribution, taking it up another $235,000 to just under $7.8 million. Should also mention, when we're looking at last year's contribution of 4.1 and increases from there, 4.1 was really kind of a local low point in the contribution. It had been higher in the few years preceding that, even though the discount rate was coming down with each step. Good asset return had helped push that contribution rate or contribution down.
And just to give you a measure of that, the year before that required contribution was 5.1 million. It went down to 4.1, and actually the budget that the board approved kept the 5.1 because we had these fears that the tea leaves we just didn't feel like that was probably going to last. So the board went ahead and kept it at 5.1 for this current year, which was higher than what they had to do.
And so the impact, again, of the assumption changes takes us to about a $7.8 million contribution, about 25.79% of payroll. And in the last column, we're showing moving to the actuarial value of assets. So there's a number of different ways to measure the actuarial value of assets, but this really takes on the idea that good things don't always continue to happen and bad things don't always continue to happen. They tend to offset over time. So with a market value, we're going to have considerable volatility in the value of assets, which is going to translate directly into a volatility of the contribution. But if we use an actuarial value of assets that smooths out these gains and losses, we expect to have less volatility in that measure, the actuarial value of assets, and less volatility in the contribution. And I've seen that in every plan that uses actuarial value of assets. It always creates a smoother result. It does not hurt the funded status of the pension plan because you're ultimately averaging in all those gains and losses eventually. As Christine, I believe, mentioned, the state of Tennessee uses a 10-year smoothing period. This is based on a 5-year smoothing period. I tend to think 5 years is a little more conservative because 10 years you tend to ignore losses and gains longer than you do with a 5-year smoothing. For example, with a 10-year smoothing, a year of large losses, you're going to ignore 90% of those in the first year versus a 5-year smoothing, you're only going to ignore 80% of them. And then you're going to pick up another 20% per year until it's all averaged in. So using this methodology, this would reduce the contribution from market value by just under $800,000, taking us to just over a $7 million contribution. I will say that if you wanted to look at a 10-year smoothing, that would likely lower it slightly. There's also some possibility of how the actuarial value of assets gets phased in. This, what I've shown here in the column again, is a 5-year smoothing where we basically fully implement it now. In other words, we in calculating it, we take the market value, we ignore 80% of last year's losses. We also ignore 60% of the gains from 2021, 40% of the gains from 2020, and so on. So we're ignoring not only some losses, we're ignoring some gains in that as well. You could phase it in where you just recognize you only back out 80% of last year's losses, and then next year you do 2 years, so you ignore 60% of 2022 losses and 80% of 2023's gains or losses, whichever the case may be. I believe this methodology produces the highest contribution, so would be, in my mind, would be the most conservative methodology right now. And I believe this is also consistent with what the funding policy states, that it's a 5-year smoothing.
Any questions?
Well,
Mary, any questions? If there,
I'll make a brief comment.
All right.
I didn't like this when I first got into this business because, I'm kind of like, I want the numbers to be the numbers. If you tell me your assets are $200 million, I want there to be $200 million on the bank. Pretty straightforward. And I think I've come around to it over time because I've watched people go through these periods with these. I mean, the numbers in this book are just crazy, even to me. I mean, a 19% decline in the stock market in a year. And you just can't budget for that in a municipality. And, you know, I typically find out, you know, when you're avoiding some of the losses, you're also simultaneously avoiding some of the gains. So it's not, it sort of sounds like a cheat, but it's not. I think it's really a better way to do things for municipal budgeting purposes. You're not going to get too off the mark with 5 years, I don't think. So I've come around to be in favor of smoothing.
And there's also something you said made me think of this. There's also a corridor where we can't let actuarial value deviate from market value by more. I think we're using 10%. 20% is still considered acceptable too, but 10% again is more conservative. Right now they'd be the same, 10 or 20.
20 is what's written
Is it 20 is what's written in? Okay.
And if I may give just a
Go ahead.
little bit of, this is the preliminary analysis from the actuary. Of course, they always have done a lot of work to get to this point, but this is the first time that the committee and staff we got our view of this at the end of last week. They continue to work on a full report as required. That report comes out more like summertime, late spring, and then when we get together in the early fall is when we come back and talk to you about the full report. We incorporate that into our annual audit, and our auditors go through that, our external auditors. So there's a lot more to go in this process, but you all have had the first blush of what the auditors, or what the actuarials report looks like for the closed pension plan.
Thanks.
If there's no other questions or comments, let's go to item 5 then. Update on the Board of Mayor and Alderman action for Resolution 2022-78, which is a change in average compensation calculation, and a Resolution 2022-79, which is a cost of living policy. Christine, you're up again.
This is an update for the committee that this committee spent lots of time and hours, also some separate conversations back in the fall, both at your September and December meetings on these 2 items. I had conversations with most of you as well, and I appreciate that and all the feedback that you gave. Wanted to follow back that the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, I believe they appreciated all the work of this committee. We went to the Board of Mayor and Alderman work session and discussed both of these items, and then they, in early January, approved both of these resolutions unanimously. And certainly Alderman Barnhill was involved in all of that. And I believe they do really respect the work that goes on in this committee, and that is reflected in their votes, as well as their comments. So both of these were approved, and I provided those signed resolutions. Since that time, that information is being communicated to employees. Our HR Director Townsell, part of this committee, and our city administrator, they did a series of employee meetings, did lots of employee meetings back in late January, and I was involved, I think, in about 6 or 7 of them, but I know I'm certain that this was something that they covered in all of the employee meetings that they did, and that way if employees were made aware, they and also knew who to go talk to if they had an interest in these. I don't know this for certain, but I would imagine there's some employees on the change in average compensation calculation have already contacted HR staff if they have some specific questions about their situation. So that is one way that the word is being communicated. So I do appreciate, I want to extend from myself my appreciation for this committee, as well as we are getting that word out, and I believe there's probably some other not as formal ways that word's getting out as well.
Any questions or concerns? Then let's go to the draft resolution 2022-03, a resolution to adopt a funding policy for the closed pension. Christine, you're up again.
Y'all are going to be tired of me by the end of this. This is an item that we've been working on for a little while, but I wanted to give you some background that while the preamble says adoption of a funding policy for the closed pension, we have had a funding policy for the closed pension for a long time. It was adopted by the board in October of 2014, and you might be wondering why we're back here all these 9 years later, almost 9 years later, talking about that. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of background for this conversation that we're going to have. This is what we call a single employer pension plan, public pension plan. Our closed plan is something that it's certainly managed by the city of Franklin. While we have assistance from the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System, all of the obligations are our own. And so something that we've seen over the years is that many years ago, the state of Tennessee did not have a lot of oversight over these single employer plans. They said it's your own plan, your own liability. But then as the years went along and there's so much complication in managing these plans, the state has had more and more oversight because we are a government, a local government. And back in 2014, this Public Employee Defined Benefit Financial Security Act was passed, became Tennessee state statute. And it had several requirements of those of us who have a single employer plan. One of those requirements was that the funding body had to adopt a funding policy, and it said what had to be in that policy. And it's also, once it's approved, it's submitted to the State Department of Tennessee's Department of Treasury, and they review it periodically. And that was done in accordance with that requirement late in 2014 and was filed. And from time to time, that does get pulled out and looked at. Now, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen has not made any changes to that plan, that policy since 2014. It's been a good policy. So certainly we've had one big change since then is that it's no longer an open plan. And so that occurred on January 1st of 2017. But other than that big change, there's really nothing in there from that 2014 plan or policy that necessitated any other changes. But then, in accordance with other aspects of that 2014 Act, that's one of my responsibilities is I actually do some filings with the Department of Treasury. They make annual reviews of the plan, send paperwork back to me, and so I am the staff contact person with the State Department of Treasury. And shortly before Christmas, I think it was about a week before Christmas, I received 2 letters from the Department of Treasury, and they were provided in your package. And both of those letters involved a review of this funding plan policy. And after Christmas, we got together as staff, our city attorney, along with our professionals, and we reviewed those closely and came up with a plan that would require the pension committee to consider and hopefully our Board of Mayor and Aldermen to approve 3 changes, substantial changes to the funding policy. And this is in accordance with what the State Department of Treasury is asking for. I have worked with the Department of Treasury and put something in writing to them, and that if the Board of Mayor and Aldermen approve this, that will satisfy their request. So I do know that that's what their staff says would satisfy their request for our funding policy. And 2 of these, the first 2 are going to be requests that probably don't seem out of line. They're just part of things change, and we do have our actuary who'll be able to address this first one a little bit. The first request of the State Department of Treasury is that we incorporate in our policy the use of mortality assumptions after June 5th, for the fiscal years beginning after June 15th, 2024. And so, Kevin, I assume that there's a large study underway that's going to change mortality assumptions.
Yeah, that'll be part of our experience study that comes up this next year. What that statute says is that you have to make sure I get the language right. It's consider and implement mortality improvements. Yes. And I think we're already including those at some level, but we'll probably do what's called fully generational, which is to assume mortality improvements happen forever for the current population. So that'll be something that gets fully implemented with the upcoming valuation.
Yeah, exactly. I believe the actual language from the state is Department of Treasury calls this expected improvement in life expectancy. So that sounds wonderful. We all want to live longer, but that it will cost more. But that's what your understanding is as well.
That's correct. And interesting, and this is a little bit off topic, but the mortality improvements continue to happen, but at a declining rate. So on a projected basis, we're not living as long as we would have projected a year ago, but we're still living longer than we would without the projection. So.
Just when we thought we had some good news, it's like, well, it's not as good as it was. So, But so that is something that the state wants us to incorporate into our policy. The second change that they have asked for is that, and this is something that our committee and our Board of Mayor and Aldermen have been advised by staff, but they would like this put into our policy, is that our investment earnings assumption for this closed plan may not exceed the TCRS earnings assumption by more than 0.5%. And that's something that we have seen historically, that the TCRS Board of Trustees, they don't act to move that rate very often, but when they do move it significantly. And so we have always been in compliance with this TCA statute. However, they have asked us to incorporate this into our funding policy. The state moved down to 6.75%. We're going to be at 6.9% in the next report that we received, and we are going to go down, I believe, to 6.5 eventually. We're going down 10 basis points, 0.1% a year until we get down to 6.5. And so we are certainly in compliance with this requirement, but this is something that they want added to our policy. And then the third change that the Department of Treasury has requested is that our 2014 funding policy gives actually 2 allowable methods of calculating the asset valuation for the purposes of our actuarial report. It gives the method that, and Barry gave a good description of it, based on actual assets at the time of the valuation, the 12/31. It also allowed for this asset smoothing method. And the way that it's described in our funding policy is a 5-year smoothing method. It has, and the documents I provided to you gives a little bit more detail about that methodology. But in effect, the 14 policy says you can do either one. And we have been doing the valuation on actual assets. And this Department of Treasury and their documentation back to the city would like us to do the asset smoothing method. And that's something that certainly we have, they are completely okay with us if we want to do the 5-year method, but versus the 10-year that TCRS uses. But they do recommend that we do the asset smoothing method and be clear in our funding policy to drop having 2 methods. They would like us to have the one method and have that listed in our funding policy. Kevin, do you have any additional any comments to that?
Well, just maybe just a little contextual comment. We see those same letters going to other municipalities and public sector entities in the state. I think certainly the first 2 items we're seeing as more of a reminder for folks of this is what the law requires, so make sure everybody notices that. And I will give the state some credit. They are looking closely at things, so they're doing a good review of the reports, funding policies, and such. They're not just checking a box to make sure it's there; they're actually reading them. So it's good to see.
And in the draft policy that I provided to you, I also took this opportunity to do just a little bit of updating that was not substantial based on, I did put some statement in there about the plan now being closed, when it was closed, just a little bit of context. But these are the substantial changes, are these 3 points here. And the Department of Treasury is asking to have this considered. This is where we start with, is in this committee, for your understanding and hopefully a consideration for a recommendation to go to our full board. And I will give just a point that on the agenda, this is actually resolution 2023-03 and not 2022. So if you are inclined to give a recommendation to our full board, it's draft of 2022-03 or 2023-03. Lots of threes in there. 2023-03. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have about this request.
Any questions from anyone from the committee on what we've just got through covering? I think most of the basis points and those we've pretty well gone over theirs. quite consistently for the last 6 months or more. So, any questions? If there are no questions, then I would entertain a motion for the committee to recommend to the full board the approval of Resolution 2023-03.
I'll make a motion for resolution 2023-03 that this committee adopt.
And this motion again is to recommend to the full board. That is a proper motion. To a second.
Second.
Proper motion and second. Let's do a roll call vote on that. Mr. Townsend, how do you vote?
Yes.
Ms. Carter, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Bull, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. McGee, how do you vote?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Let the record show that it passed 5-0. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay. If not, then let's go to item 7. And that is consideration of draft resolution 2023-19, a resolution adopting the Fourth Amendment to the City of Franklin amended and restated employee pension plan dated effective as of January the 1st, 2018, increasing the lump sum threshold to $25,000 for terminated vested participants. Christine, you're up again on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an item that we as staff have been discussing along with our pension counsel and our city attorney and our actuary. And I think I'm going to ask Mr. Carney, our pension counsel, to describe what this addresses and what is a lump sum threshold, and let him give you his description, and then the rest of us may chime in afterwards. But I think that would lay the groundwork the best. Thank you.
Okay. This is basically to keep the plan from having to pay very small monthly benefits to participants over their lifetimes, because doesn't really move the needle for the participant, and it's administrative kind of difficulties for the city. So it gives the participant, if the participant's account is under $1,000, there's a cash out. You just cash the participant out. If it's over that, and prior to this resolution, if it was between 1,000 and 15, you gave the participant an option to either elect the lump sum or to take a refund of the participant's mandatory contributions out of the plan. And all this amendment does is raise that from 15,000 to 25,000. So it'll just, it theoretically would increase the participants who can take that option and kinds of release the administrative pressure on the city to have to continually pay out these small benefits.
And I believe that historically, this may have been it's gone up a couple of times,
It
maybe
has.
in 2005, and then in 2016 was the last time I believe that
Right,
this
it
has
went
been
from
adjusted.
10 in 2005 to 15 in 2016, and this would move it up to 25. And some of that is just taking into consideration inflation and just the time value of money, to just kind of trace along with that as the years pass.
And certainly, someone who has chosen to terminate but was vested, he or she may be at different points in their careers, but in some cases, one option with these monies is someone could have moved on to another career, and they could roll that into, if they went into private sector, maybe a 401 at their new employer, kind of help them move on with their life and their retirement planning, as well as it can assist the city in its record keeping, but this is something that a former employee may find beneficial, especially someone who has got a number of more years to work and would like to roll that into something else that they are doing.
Or if they're moving to TCRS, this is cash they can get to help pay for that service over at TCRS, because it'd be a cash amount distribution to them.
Any questions on item 7, resolution 2023-19?
I've got I think I understand the $1,000, the bottom limit of that. Is there a reason why it's not going up, or is there an advantage to bumping it up higher than 1,000?
The $1,000 came out of the federal legislation, not out of state. And the federal government passed this some time ago, passed a statute that if somebody's under $1,000, you could cash them out, because prior to that, you could only cash somebody out with their consent. And then they also added up to $5,000, you can do what's called an automatic rollover. So these were federal statutes to help the plan to get rid of these really small accounts. So we just didn't change it because it's a federal standard. That's really it. I mean, if they changed it, we'd probably change it too.
And something that we have been batting around and thought we would, especially with having him, we would ask the pension committee for any feedback, was certainly there could be some terminated vested employees that are between the 15,000 and the 25,000 that they left here a number of years ago, and they left maybe when it was 15,000, and now they would be in the threshold if this was approved by the board. And something that we had talked about was if there was and we could certainly, if that seemed like this was feasible, talk about how to write this, but perhaps being able to go back and offer those people who have left, who would be in that category, do something to optionally allow them to pull their funds out. Maybe they would like to roll it into a current employer, or help them. They've already been gone. They've already moved on with their life and their career. But would we want to go back and offer, because that's something the actuary keeps up with, is who are the former employees that would fit into the category that they now would be eligible for this lump sum threshold that didn't meet it when they departed us. Kevin could address that group a little bit.
Yeah, we did go back and look at that group, and there are, I want to say, maybe up to 30 people who fall in that range of between 15 and 25. And I believe the way it's written, it would allow you to go back and offer it to those individuals as
If you
well.
choose to, the current resolution has a blank for when you want it to be effective. So you could set an effective date for employees hiring, terminating after a certain date.
But there could be a value to the employer and that former employee to select this now, if, especially that employee that left here and has gone on with his or her career and would like to take those monies and roll that into a new employer.
So sometimes lump sums can have a negative impact on the plan, but I'm presuming with this small of a workforce, there's no real negative.
Yeah, we don't see really any meaningful negative here. And it is, from an administrative standpoint, I think it eases the complexity of administering the plan. It's kind of an ongoing problem in all pension plans, the issue of what's just generally called lost participants. It's where people leave, and it's almost always small benefit amounts, and it's hard to locate them again unless they come back asking to start their pension. And if it's been 30 years, folks forget. And so it becomes hard to track these folks down at times to pay the benefit.
And you've recently experienced what happens when they reach 70 and a half, or now 72 and a half, or now they keep moving the lot. And so you've got this account here that you've got to distribute, and you've got to find that person. Makes it difficult.
Yeah, because you can have the IRS and the DOL saying you have to pay these people at 70 and a half or 72, and like, how?
Yeah, right.
If we can't locate them, we can't pay them. So it's a challenge.
So we wanted to bring that to you all, see if there was any conversation or if we're not thinking of something that you all may think of, but it seemed like a time to talk about if this is a opportunity to modernize that threshold a little bit.
I guess I just have a question. You talked about what date to use. It seemed like that wasn't necessarily determined yet, but I guess I'm just curious how we would get to that point.
It's a good question, but it's up to you as to whether you want to go back. Now you know what your exposure is, and that's the first thing you want to know, because lump sums can have negative impacts. It doesn't in your situation. So it's really up to you whether you want to make it retroactive to any accounts you've got out there that's under these amounts. You could do that. Or whether you want to make it prospective. That's really your choice. I can draft it either way.
And I think as long as it's optional, because there may be some of that 30 we can't find. I mean,
Could
we
be.
do the best we can, but as long as it's an optional go back and the best records we can find, we can to locate those 30 people and give them that option. And if he or she chooses not to, it should be optional. He or she shouldn't have to. But there may be some of those that would elect, and we wouldn't have to keep up with them, and he or she can move on with their retirement planning. So if you're agreeable to allow it to be an optional to go back, then we could pursue that with those approximately 30 former employees.
Eric, since you're going to be setting a budget that has or has not,
Well, in this case, this is really how we manage the funds that are in the pension itself. It doesn't have any real budgetary impact in terms of operations. So, I mean, I don't see this, the other stuff we've talked about earlier today are going to have far more budgetary impacts. This is really the kind of the rules of the road, and these are ways for us to, I think, simplify how we manage the pool of eligible folks in our pension program, especially these lower dollar amounts that a lot of these folks may have almost forgotten that they have it. And if it's an opportunity to clean it up, that's probably a good thing, could be good for us. And again, as Christine said, it's optional. So I don't see a lot of downside from the city, except for it just gives us the ability to maybe streamline the number of folks we're working with over time in the pension program. In a closed pension program. It's all about the closed pension.
any questions, additional questions or comments? If not, I think we've heard a pretty good explanation of draft of Resolution 2023-19. The same goes with this. This would be a recommendation to the full board. When would we see that on the full board?
This one may take a couple more weeks for the attorneys to get the language together.
End of
So
April?
maybe we'll, we currently have the first item on the funding policy for the April 11th work session. The full board would hopefully vote on it at the end of April. This may go to work session end of April, 1st of May.
Okay.
It's something that we would like to ask for, but if it takes the attorneys a few weeks to get all
We'll
that
work
language
rapidly.
right. So it's just this was just something that just seemed like a good time to ask to modernize. But it doesn't have the same time constraints as the Department of Treasury's requests.
If there are no other questions, I'll entertain a motion to approve draft resolution 2023-19 and to forward to the full board for discussion and approval whenever it goes through the process.
I'll make that motion, and I think we ought to make it retroactive to whoever's on the books that falls below the threshold. So however I need to say that.
Whoever's
that's the
within that
motion.
valuation. Yeah.
Perfect.
Proper motion, and is there a second?
Second.
Let's do a roll call vote. Mr. Townsend, how do you vote?
I vote yes.
Ms. Carter, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Bull, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. McGee, how do you vote?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes on that. That passes 5-0. That's all of the items that we have. Less other business. We have one item on other business.
In looking at this year's calendar, certainly the date sounds, the date is what we're asking, but the first Monday after Labor Day this year is on Monday, September the 11th. We're asking, that would be our next in-person meeting, September the 11th at 1 p.m. And we would, I would follow back up with all of you with a written report from the pension this summer, probably June or July, and but then we'll get together in September if that's agreeable. And certainly, we as staff are glad to answer questions in the meantime.
So that's 9/11 you're talking about, right?
Yes, yes.
I'm just trying to remember what times the city does things on 9/11. Is that early in the morning?
Is it the morning, Eric?
When we've done it, and we haven't done it every year, we've done it in sync with when the events of 9/11 occurred. So it's typically in the morning around 8:30.
Okay.
Any other questions about that particular day? If not, then let's set that up for September the 11th at 1 p.m. And again, if you need to change it or something comes up or whatever, I don't think would be a particularly big deal if you wanted to move it out a week, move it back a week. Well, I couldn't move it back a week, but you could move it out a week. All right, so the next scheduled meeting for this committee will be September the 11th. And the time is 1 PM. Anything else to come before the committee? Then I will take Christine's favorite motion. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Proper motion to a second.
Second.
All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Yes.